3 winters of candle wax, wilted roses, and dance cards gone blank at the edges had taught Cecily Dean exactly how a ballroom could turn cold while 100 chandeliers still blazed. By the end of her 3rd season, the air itself seemed to know her defeat. Powder, perfume, hot beeswax, damp wool from cloaks left in the hall, it all clung to her skin as if London meant to preserve her like some unsuccessful exhibit in glass. Men bowed, smiled, drifted on. Mothers looked through her. Girls younger than she was whispered behind lace fans and then grew pink with the thrill of being cruel. She had been named, and once society gives a woman a name, it will use it until she can no longer remember the sound of her own. The Spinster of Marlow Street. It had begun as a jest at a supper table. By now it moved through drawing rooms like a tune everyone knew. That evening the music at Lady Wexford's assembly was bright enough to make a lyre of sorrow. Violins skimmed, slippers whispered over polished floorboards, silver trays flashed in the candlelight. Cecily stood near a marble mantel beneath a bowl of hothouse lilies whose thick sweetness made her head ache, and watched her cousins perform delight as if they had been born to it. Clarissa laughed too loudly at gentlemen who were not worth the trouble, while Imogen kept up a running little murmur meant to look innocent and land like pins. "Poor Cecily," one of them said, not quite softly enough. "One does begin to think Marlow Street may keep her forever." They did not even trouble to face her when they said it. That was the humiliation of such mockery. It was not delivered like an insult, only arranged around her as though she were furniture. She might have borne even that if home had offered mercy, but home had become a council chamber of quiet surrender. 2 nights earlier, passing the morning room with her workbox in hand, she had heard her uncle's voice through the half-closed door, dry, decisive. "It cannot go on. Hortensia requires a companion, and Cecily is of no present use here." Of no present use. Her mother had answered in a weary whisper, the kind a woman uses when she is too tired to fight and too proud to beg. Great-aunt Hortensia was rich, widowed, and infamous from one county to the next for reducing companions to pale silence. She wanted obedience, gratitude, invisibility. In other words, she wanted a nurse who would not call herself one. Since that moment, Cecily had carried the knowledge inside her like a folded blade. 1 more week, perhaps less, and the carriage would come for her. So she stood under the lilies and understood, with a steadiness that almost frightened her, that this might be the last ball of her life, the last before disappearance. Her gaze moved over the room without much interest until it caught, quite against her will, on a tall man near the far bookcase in the music room beyond the arch. He was not dancing. He was not speaking. He had the remote, closed expression of a man enduring society rather than joining it, and yet when an elderly footman fumbled a stack of music folios, that same gentleman bent at once, gathered the papers, and put them right with such unshowy care that Cecily felt something inside her pause. She knew him by sight, of course, everybody did. Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Aldermore, the reclusive nobleman whom hostesses pursued and mothers discussed in lowered voices. He straightened, accepted no thanks, and for one brief moment looked across the archway directly at her, as if he had caught her witnessing something he had not meant anyone to see. And then he began to walk toward her. If you enjoy slow-burn historical romance, subscribe and stay with me for the next part. He did not come with the easy smile of a practiced flirt. He crossed the room as a man crosses unfamiliar ground, carefully, as if he had no wish to alarm what he approached. By the time Julian Ashcombe stopped before her, Cecily could hear the faint clink of glass from the supper room, the sweep of a violin bow, the heavy sweetness of the lilies pressing against the back of her throat. "Miss Dean," he said, with a bow exact enough to be respectful and nothing more. "You appear in want of air." It was such a plain remark that she almost laughed. not because it was witty, but because it was true. She placed her fingertips against the cool marble edge of the mantel and answered, "Do I appear so very transparent?" His gaze flicked once toward the flowers. "Only to anyone standing under those lilies. They would overpower a stronger constitution than yours." There was the smallest pause. Then he offered his arm toward the open archway that led to a side corridor, and beyond that, a terrace. No one watching could have objected. It was the sort of harmless civility every ballroom understood. Cecily hesitated only a heartbeat before accepting. If she remained where she was, Clarissa would return. If she stepped away, at least the humiliation would change its shape. The terrace stones still held the day's warmth, though the night air was damp and smelled faintly of box hedges and recent rain. Somewhere in the square beyond the garden wall, carriage wheels ground against gravel. Cecily drew a breath deep enough to clear her head. Julian remained at a proper distance, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his face turned partly toward the light spilling from the windows. "You saw me with the music," he said at last. The directness of it startled her. "Yes. And you looked as if I had committed an act of rare heroism." "No," she said, "only an act of kindness without witnesses." Society prizes the second much more than the first. That drew something almost like amusement into his eyes. It did not reach his mouth, but it changed him. For one fleeting instant, the severe, unreachable Duke became simply a tired man who had heard the truth and did not know whether to be grateful for it. "Then we are both out of fashion," he said. She should have let the moment pass. She should have spoken of the weather or the music or gone back inside. Instead, perhaps because the night had already gone wrong, perhaps because despair makes strange companions of honesty and recklessness, she asked, "Are you also to be put to some useful purpose, my lord?" He turned his head fully then. The house lights caught the hard line of his cheek and the shadow beneath his eyes. "That depends," he said quietly. "Do you call being marched toward a lady with 20,000 a year and no ear for the word no a useful purpose?" Cecily stared. Of all the answers she had expected, that was not one. For the first time that evening, her misery loosened enough to make room for surprise. Before she could speak, the door behind them opened. Her cousin Imogen leaned into the terrace light with a smile that looked sweet from a distance and poisonous from anywhere near. "There you are, Cecily. Aunt has sent the carriage home already. She says there is no reason to stay now." Her gaze slid to the Duke and brightened with instant calculation. "Oh, I beg pardon. I had no notion you were engaged in confidential conversation." Julian's expression closed at once. Cecily felt the old humiliation rise, hot and familiar. Yet as she moved past him toward the door, he said in a voice pitched for her alone, "Miss Dean, you look like a woman considering an outrageous decision." And when she reached home, she found a sealed letter waiting on the hall table, addressed in her great-aunt Hortensia's spidery hand. The letter lay on the hall table like a summons from a lesser kingdom, thin and sharp-edged beneath the lamp glow, its seal impressed so hard the wax had cracked. Cecily knew her great-aunt's hand at once. Those long, slanting letters always looked less written than scratched. Her mother, who had come home tired and silent, loosened her gloves beside the fire and said, without looking up, "You had better open it now." The paper smelled faintly of lavender gone stale in a drawer. Hortensia had written with dreadful briskness. She expected Cecily at her house on Monday. A room had been prepared. The doctor recommended regular attendance. Suitable plain gowns would be required. The final line was the worst of all. It carried gratitude in the same tone another woman might have used to order coal. "Your usefulness will at last be properly directed." Her mother sank into a chair as if the words had pressed upon her shoulders, too. "My dear, it may not be as terrible as people say." Cecily folded the letter with care she did not feel. That is not a sentence ever spoken of a happy future. For a moment her mother's composure slipped. What would you have me do? Your uncle will not oppose it. We cannot afford opposition in this house, only consequences. That was the true misery of it. No one here was wicked in the dramatic manner of novels. They were frightened, dependent, careful with money, careful with comfort, careful above all never to disturb the arrangement by which they remained fed and housed. Cecily had become part of that arrangement, like the sideboard or the extra maid who might one day be let go. She kissed her mother's cheek, though her own throat burned, and went upstairs carrying the letter as though it might stain her fingers. She slept hardly at all. Rain whispered against the window panes. Somewhere below, the house groaned and settled in the dark. Again and again she saw the Duke's face when she had asked if he too was being driven toward some useful purpose. Again and again she heard his voice. You look like a woman considering an outrageous decision. By morning, outrage had ripened into thought. There was one place in town where she could pass an hour unremarked if she chose the proper time. A subscription reading room attached to an old circulating library near Hanover Square. Her uncle despised such places as unfashionable, which made them useful. Near noon, with a plain bonnet tied tight beneath her chin and the damp spring air cold on her cheeks, Cecily went there under the pretense of exchanging a borrowed volume. The bell above the door gave a dull little clang. Inside, the room smelled of dust, old paper, and the iron stove that had not yet quite gone out for the season. She almost lost her nerve when she saw him. Julian stood near the history shelves with a book open in his hand, and that same withdrawn stillness about him, as if silence fit him better than company ever had. He looked up at once, more as if he had half expected a storm and had just heard the first drop strike glass. "Miss Dean," he said. "My lord?" The librarian, an elderly woman with silver spectacles balanced low on her nose, was sorting periodicals at the far table. No one else was near enough to listen. Cecily felt the beat of her own pulse in her wrists. "I have done a reckless thing," she said quietly. One dark brow lifted. "Have you done it already?" "No." She drew a breath. "I came to ask whether you are still in need of an outrageous decision." He closed the book with one hand, very slowly, and after the smallest pause said, "There is a solicitor 2 streets from here who owes my family discretion. If you mean to continue, Miss Dean, you had better sit down first." He did not offer comfort. In that moment, Cecily was grateful for it. The reading room suddenly felt smaller, the air close with dust and old leather, the ticking clock on the mantel too loud for such a quiet place. Julian drew out a chair at a side table near the window, and when she sat, he remained standing for a moment as though measuring the danger before he chose to share it. Then he took the seat opposite her, folding his gloves with deliberate care. "You understand," he said, "that whatever you are about to propose cannot be half done. Society forgives folly if it is amusing. It does not forgive calculation in a woman." A faint, bitter smile touched her mouth. "Then I am fortunate, for society has already settled on folly." His gaze sharpened. "Do not make light of it. If your name is mishandled now, it may never be set right." "My name is being packed in a trunk from my great-aunt's house," she answered. "I do not know what greater injury remains to fear." That seemed to strike him more deeply than any tears could have done. He leaned back slightly, and for the first time she saw weariness plainly on him. It lived in the looseness of his shoulders, in the pause before each reply, in the expression of a man who had spent too many months saying no and being heard as an obstacle rather than a person. "My mother," he said after a beat, "has determined that I shall offer for Miss Penelope Vane before the month is out. Her father wishes the match. My sister wishes it. The lady herself wishes only for my title, which is at least honest of her. If I delay much longer, I will find myself maneuvered into a dinner, then a country visit, then some arrangement everyone calls inevitable. Cecily listened very still. It was a strange thing, hearing Power speak of being cornered. He was a duke. He could command a dozen households, dismiss servants with a word, influence tenants, appoint stewards, refuse invitations. Yet here, in a narrow room that smelled of paper glue and coal ash, he sounded as trapped as she felt. "So," she said softly, "you require an obstacle." He gave one short nod. "A public one. Something respectable enough to halt pursuit and inconvenient enough that no one may challenge it without risking their own dignity." The words settled between them. Outside, a cart rolled over wet stones. Somewhere beyond the shelves, the librarian coughed into a handkerchief. Cecily lowered her eyes to the grain of the table. Her gloves were old. One fingertip had been carefully mended with thread a shade too dark. She heard herself ask, very steadily, "If you were suddenly engaged, would that suffice?" He did not answer at once. When she looked up, he was watching her with an intensity that made her pulse trip, simply attentive, as if he had known this was the shape her desperation might take, and had hoped, for her sake, to be wrong. "It would suffice," he said at last. "For me. For a time. But for you. For me it would prevent Monday." The bluntness of that seemed to close the last distance between them. Julian set his gloves aside. "Miss Dean, if we do this, it must be governed. No foolish promises, no private claims afterward, no expectation beyond the purpose agreed." A flush rose in her face, though she had given him no reason to fear romance from her. "I seek rescue from a sick room, not an altar speech." That almost smile returned, gone in a breath. "Then we understand each other." He rose. She thought the decision had been made, until he bent, rested 2 fingers against the edge of the table near her hand, and said in a lower tone, "There is still time to go home and choose caution." Cecily thought of Hortensia's letter, of Clarissa's laughter, of a life shrinking by the hour. "No," she said. "Take me to your solicitor." And Julian, after one long look at her face, led her through the side door and into the wet gray street where a closed carriage had just drawn up to the curb. The carriage smelled of rain-damp leather and clean wool. Cecily sat opposite Julian on the narrow seat, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the seams of her gloves pressed into her skin. Neither of them spoke much as the wheels rattled over uneven stones. Once, when the carriage lurched around a corner, his hand shifted as if to steady her, then stopped upon his knee. That small restraint unsettled her more than a bold gesture would have done. Through the blurred glass, she saw shop fronts, a boy sweeping muddy steps, a row of plane trees blackened by the weather. Ordinary things. It seemed impossible that the whole shape of her life might alter before the next church bell struck. Their destination was not grand. The solicitor kept rooms behind a stationer's shop on a quiet street where the windows were narrow and the brass plate had gone dull with age. Inside, the passage smelled of sealing wax, old ink, and the faint sourness of papers stored too long. A clerk in sleeves and waistcoat looked up, recognized Julian, and became very still. No introductions were offered in the hall. They were shown at once into a back room with a coal fire burned low to ash, shelves bowed beneath deed boxes, and a green-shaded lamp that cast a pool of yellow light over the desk. There Mr. Pritchard rose from his chair. He was a spare man with silver at his temples and eyes that missed very little. "Your lordship," he said, and then to Cecily with a courteous inclination, "Miss Dean?" Julian did not waste time. "We require an agreement drawn at once."
confidentially.
If the request startled the man, he hid it well. He merely gestured for them to sit and took up his pen. What followed might have sounded cold to any listener who expected romance from desperation. It was anything but romantic. Dates, terms, public conduct, duration. A formal engagement to be announced without delay. No marriage to follow unless both parties later consented. At the conclusion of an agreed period, the understanding might be dissolved under respectable circumstances, with blame falling upon neither. Cecily listened to the scratch of pen against paper and felt, oddly, calmer with every clause. It gave shape to danger. It placed edges around panic. Then came the question of money. Mr. Pritchard cleared his throat. "Miss Dean must be safeguarded, my lord. If her name is publicly tied to yours and then released, there must be provision." Heat rose in Cecily's face at once. "I do not mean to bargain for myself." "You must," Julian said quietly. "I will not have you left exposed because my household becomes inconvenient." The firmness of it silenced her. They discussed a sum to be settled on her should the engagement end, enough to free her from dependence on her uncle and from Hortensia forever. She had never in her life heard such figures connected to her own future. They sounded unreal, like sums in a novel no sensible woman believed. Yet when Mr. Pritchard drafted a clause more favorable to Julian, the Duke corrected it himself, crossing out a line with one swift stroke and dictating fairer terms. Cecily watched the black ink dry and understood that whatever else he was not careless with another person's dignity. At last, the pages were sanded, shaken clean, and turned toward them. The room had grown very quiet. Even the clerk outside seemed to have stopped moving. Mr. Pritchard placed a fresh pen beside the first sheet. "This," he said, glancing from one to the other, "will protect you if handled with discipline, but I advise you both to remember that arrangements of this kind have a way of attracting the curiosity of relations." Julian signed first. His name ran bold and assured across the page. Then the pen was laid before her. Cecily looked down at the lines that would save her and bind her to him in the eyes of the world. Just as she reached for the pen, voices sounded in the outer office, and one of them belonged unmistakably to her cousin Clarissa. The sound of Clarissa's voice ran through Cecily like cold water. It came muffled through the door at first, bright and careless, the way some women speak when they have never once had to doubt that a room will welcome them. Imogen's softer tone followed close behind. The sisters were asking the clerk for a direction to a milliner on the next street, though even in her alarm Cecily knew at once that Clarissa never asked directions for anything she could command. Mr. Pritchard's pen stopped in mid-air. Julian did not move, but something in his face hardened into absolute attention. "Can they know you were here?" he asked in a low voice. "No, unless they followed me." Cecily heard how wild that sounded, yet the idea would not leave her. Clarissa missed very little when spite promised entertainment. Mr. Pritchard rose at once and crossed to the door. He opened it just enough to speak into the outer office, his tone mild, almost bored. A murmur followed, then the scrape of shoes, then the bell above the street door giving its dull complaint as the cousins withdrew. Only when the silence settled again did Cecily realize she had half risen from her chair. Julian looked at her hands still suspended above the paper. "Sit," he said, not sharply, but with that calm force that expected obedience because it offered steadiness with it. If they had seen enough to matter, they would not have left so quickly. She sat. Her pulse was still knocking against her throat. The room seemed warmer now. The low fire breathing out stale heat, the lamp flame wavering faintly in the draught. Mr. Pritchard returned to the desk and folded his hands. "If I may be plain," he said, "the danger is no longer in the making of the arrangement, but in the keeping of it. Once your engagement is announced, every relation on both sides will develop an interest in details that never concerned them before. The truth of that was so obvious it almost made Cecily laugh. Family indifference could turn to avid curiosity in a single afternoon if a title stood near it. Julian picked up the pen and set it closer to her. "Miss Dean, this remains your choice." She looked at him then, really looked, at the composed mouth, the tired eyes, the unadorned honesty of a man who had offered terms rather than seduction. He was giving her a last opening, even now. If she stood and went home, Monday would still come. Hortensia would still be waiting. Clarissa would still smirk over breakfast. Nothing would have altered, except that she would know she had been offered a door and lacked the courage to cross it. So Cecily bent over the desk and wrote her name. The scratch of the nib sounded absurdly small for such a decision. Yet once the final stroke was laid down, something inside her went still. Mr. Pritchard drew the paper toward him, sanded the ink, and nodded as if some private calculation had now balanced. "There," he said, "the thing exists." Julian signed the witness line below. The clerk was summoned, solemn and red-eared, to add his own hand. Then the solicitor prepared 2 copies, one to remain sealed in his strong box, one for Julian. Cecily had expected some sense of triumph. Instead, she felt a curious lightness mixed with fear, like stepping onto a bridge in fog and hearing the river far below. Business, however, was not yet done. Mr. Pritchard asked practical questions that made her cheeks burn afresh. When would the announcement be made? How soon would the Duke begin formal calls? What reason might later be given if the understanding were dissolved? Julian answered each with grave efficiency. A fortnight for public certainty, no hasty wedding talk, distance, if needed, to soften attention when the time came. It was all terribly sensible. It was all, in its own way, merciful. When at last they rose to leave, Julian took the sealed copy from the desk and slipped it inside the inner breast pocket of his coat. His fingers paused there for the briefest moment, as though feeling the weight of more than paper. Then he turned to Cecily. "By this evening," he said, "your uncle must hear it from me before he hears it from anyone else." And in that instant she understood that surviving the contract had been the easy part. Going home with a duke at her side would be something else entirely. The ride back to Marlow Street seemed shorter than the one that had carried her away from it, though Cecily felt she had crossed some invisible border and could never quite return the same. The rain had thinned to a silver mist. It purled on the carriage glass and blurred the lamps outside into trembling halos. Opposite her, Julian sat in thoughtful silence, one hand resting near the breast of his coat where the folded agreement lay hidden. He looked composed, but there was a tension about him now, as if he were bracing not for battle exactly, but for the cold form of resistance that waits behind family doors. "You need not come in," she said, though the words sounded weak even to herself. "Yes," he answered, "I do." Nothing more, only that. Yet something in her eased. When the carriage stopped before her uncle's house, the front steps glistened black with rain. A maid opened the door before the knocker had fully fallen, and the girl's eyes widened so round at the sight of the Duke that she nearly forgot to curtsy. Warm air met them at once, carrying the smell of coal smoke, damp umbrellas, and the boiled onions from the servants' supper below stairs. It was the ordinary air of her ordinary home, and suddenly it felt painfully small. Her uncle was in the back room, though the light had long since gone from the windows. He had been taking claret with the evening paper beside him. Her mother sat near the fire with a basket of mending unopened in her lap. Clarissa and Imogen, who had clearly not expected such entertainment to arrive at the door, were both present as well. That alone told Cecily her cousins had already been chattering over their afternoon discoveries, however incomplete those discoveries might be. The silence when Julian entered was extraordinary. Her uncle rose so abruptly that his glass tipped, leaving a dark stain on the side table. "Your Grace." Julian bowed with perfect gravity. "Mr. Dean, Mrs. Dean, ladies." Clarissa recovered first. She always did. "What a distinction from Marlow Street," she said lightly, though her eyes darted at once towards Cecily. "We are quite overcome." Imogen gave a little breath of laughter that did not fool anyone. Cecily felt her face grow warm, but Julian spoke before her uncle could ask a single confused question. He did not circle the matter. He did not soften it with charming phrases. He simply said, in a tone so calm it seemed to still the room itself, that he had called to request permission to pay his addresses to Miss Cecily Dean, and that Miss Dean had done him the honor of accepting his hand. Her mother made the smallest sound, almost a gasp, then pressed her fingers to her lips. Mr. Dean stared as if the floor had shifted beneath him. "Accepted, sir?" "Accepted," Julian repeated. It was strange to hear the shape of a lie spoken with such dignity that the whole room bowed before it. Cecily stood very straight, though her knees had gone uncertain beneath her skirts. If anyone looked closely enough, they would see at once that she had not the air of a blushing bride. She had the air of a woman holding a pane of glass against a storm. Then everything broke at once. Her mother began to weep softly from sheer astonishment. Her uncle demanded details. Clarissa's color rose so swiftly it was almost violent. Imogen looked from one face to the next with naked appetite for scandal. Questions flew. Since when? How had this begun? Why had nothing been said before? Julian answered with elegant precision and just enough reserve to make further inquiry improper. They had become acquainted over several recent gatherings. He had wished to speak only when his intentions were settled. He hoped the family would forgive the brevity of the interval between understanding and declaration. It was masterful, really, the way he performed devotion without overplaying tenderness. And then Clarissa, smiling too sweetly, said, "How curious, for Cecily was out alone this afternoon as well. I wonder, cousin, whether congratulations are all that were arranged today." The question hung in the room like the smell of something singed. Clarissa had spoken lightly, but the malice beneath it was bright as polished steel. Cecily felt every eye turn to her. Her mother's tears stopped at once. Her uncle's face tightened with the old habit of suspicion that poverty teaches respectable men. Imogen leaned back against the mantel with her hands folded, watching as if she had paid for a seat at the theater. Julian did not so much as glance toward Clarissa. He kept his attention on Mr. Dean, which somehow made the insult seem smaller than it had a right to be. "Yes," he said, "congratulations were arranged today." The calm of it disarmed the room for a moment. Her uncle blinked. "Then this understanding is very recent?" "It is recent in declaration," Julian replied, "not in intention." He spoke the line so smoothly that even Cecily nearly believed it. Clarissa, however, narrowed her eyes. She had been hoping for fluster, for denial, for some visible seam she might pick apart. Instead, she found herself shut out by perfect composure, and nothing enrages a meddling woman faster than being denied spectacle. Mrs. Dean rose with trembling hands and crossed to her daughter. The silk of her gown rustled softly over the carpet. She touched Cecily's cheek as if reassuring herself that the girl before her had not dissolved into mist and fantasy. "My dear child," she whispered, "why did you not tell me?" Because there had been nothing to tell until this afternoon. Because terror moves faster than honesty. Because if she had spoken too soon, the whole invention might have shattered in her mouth. Cecily said none of that. She only took her mother's hand and pressed it. Julian then asked, with grave courtesy, whether he might have a few moments alone with Mr. Dean to discuss formal particulars. It was a master stroke. Men who might doubt romance rarely doubt business. Within minutes, the ladies had been edged from the room, Clarissa and Imogen included, though neither went willingly. In the passage outside, the house felt altered already. The wallpaper, the umbrella stand, the faded runner on the stairs, all the familiar things seemed to belong to a life that had just slipped half an inch out of place. Her mother drew Cecily into the small back parlor and shut the door with shaking fingers. "Tell me the truth." There it was. Fear, not accusation or excitement. Cecily looked at the woman who had loved her as best she knew how, yet had still allowed silence to crowd around her daughter's life until there had been scarcely any air left in it. The truth, in its full shape, was impossible. So she gave the portion that could stand upright. "He has offered for me," she said. "He means to make it public at once, and if he does, I shall not be sent to Aunt Hortensia." Her mother closed her eyes. Relief moved across her face so plainly that it was almost painful to witness. "Then I shall thank heaven first and ask questions later." But questions were already gathering in other corners of the house. Clarissa drifted near the doorway under pretense of seeking her shawl. Imogen lingered by the staircase, pretending to examine a broken tassel on the curtain tie. Both were listening. Both had scented something irregular. Cecily could almost feel their curiosity pressing against the paneling. After what felt like an age, the morning room door opened. Julian emerged first, Mr. Dean just behind him, flushed and unsettled, yet trying hard to look pleased by what he had plainly decided was a miraculous stroke of fortune. There would be announcements sent in the morning. A call from the Duke tomorrow. No mention, her uncle said rather stiffly, of any previous plan concerning Great-Aunt Hortensia. That matter was, of course, entirely set aside. Set aside. Just like that. A future cancelled with a gentleman's nod. Julian crossed the hall to take his leave. For one brief second, sheltered by the turn of the staircase and the dim light of the single lamp, he looked directly at Cecily. The stern mask slipped just enough for her to see fatigue there, and something gentler than fatigue. "Tomorrow at 11, he said. She nodded. Then he was gone into the wet night, and almost before the front door had shut, Clarissa said from behind her, very softly, "How extraordinary. By noon you were nobody's concern, and by evening a duke has remembered your existence. I wonder who taught the spinster of Marlow Street such clever timing." She did not answer Clarissa that night. There are moments when silence is not weakness at all, but the only dignified cloth a woman can throw over a scene already threatening to turn vulgar. Cecily merely looked at her cousin, then past her, and climbed the stairs with what composure she could gather around herself. Behind her she could hear the low hum of resumed voices, her mother fluttering, her uncle attempting importance, Imogen's whisper quick and eager as a match being struck. In her chamber, the candle flame bent in the draught from the window frame, and her room smelled faintly of lavender water and old linen. Everything was familiar. Nothing felt safe. She sat on the edge of her bed without removing her gloves. The events of the day moved through her in fragments. The solicitor's green lamp, Julian's steady hand, Hortensia's letter lying open like a sentence pronounced, her own name beside his on a page that did not love her, and yet had saved her. She ought to have felt triumph. Instead, she felt a strange, suspended terror. A public falsehood, once spoken, takes on a body of its own. By tomorrow it would be at breakfast tables and in carriage conversations, carried from house to house by ladies who called gossip concern and cruelty astonishment. Sleep came late and lightly. When morning did arrive, it did not creep, but crashed. The bell at the front door seemed to ring without cease. Notes arrived, cards arrived. One florist's boy appeared with a basket of white hothouse blooms sent by an aunt who had never once remembered Cecily's birthday. A neighbor called before 11 under the excuse of borrowing a pattern. Even the cook came upstairs once on a silly pretense simply to stare and curtsy and grin. By noon, the house on Marlow Street had been transformed into a place where news had happened. And then Julian came. This time there was no rain on his coat, no secrecy, no back room smelling of ink and dust. He entered by the front door in full daylight with all the proper ceremony of a gentleman calling upon his fiancée. The servants almost trembled with importance. Cecily, waiting in the drawing room, heard his voice in the hall before she saw him, calm, deep, controlled. It reached her through the half-open door like the first note of a piece she had only practiced in private and now must perform before strangers. He bowed over her hand as her mother watched with damp-eyed wonder. "Miss Dean?" "My lord?" His gaze met hers only for a second, but it held a quiet question. "Are you standing? Are you steady?" She gave the smallest nod. He turned at once to all the ordinary business of a call, and if his courtesy was flawless, it was also careful. He did not crowd her. He did not attempt intimacy where witnesses stood. Yet he placed his chair slightly nearer hers than strict indifference required, and once, when Clarissa drifted into the room with false sweetness dripping from every word, he redirected the conversation so neatly that she found herself sidelined without being able to protest. Cecily saw it then. This was how rank protected when it chose to, not through raised voices, through arrangement, through tone, through making insolence appear clumsy. After some minutes, her mother, in a fever of tact too transparent to fool anyone, suggested that Miss Dean might show the Duke the small morning conservatory at the back of the house, as the light there was especially pleasant. It was not especially pleasant. It was overheated in summer, chilly in spring, and mostly used for storing neglected geraniums. But it had a door that shut, and everybody knew why she had suggested it. So they crossed the passage together. The conservatory glass was filmed with the pale dust of the season. Outside, the narrow garden shone wet and dark, box hedges trimmed too close, the gravel walk gleaming under a thin wash of sun. Inside, the air held the damp green smell of turned soil and terracotta. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was full. "At least," Julian said at last, glancing back toward the house, "your cousin has not yet learned discretion." She was never in danger of it. That drew a soft breath from him that might almost have been a laugh. Cecily looked at him then and saw, more clearly than she had before, the fatigue beneath his polished exterior. He had dressed the part this morning. Society would say he performed devotion admirably, but up close she could see the effort in it, the strain of maintaining a fiction already greedy for witnesses. "I did not thank you properly," she said. "You need not thank me." "I do. My whole life altered yesterday." His expression changed, though only slightly. The reserve did not vanish, but it thinned. "So did mine." The words settled between them, simple and heavier than anything grander might have been. Then a shadow moved across the conservatory door. Clarissa had not entered. She was standing just beyond the glass, motionless, listening, and in her hand was the calling card Julian had left on the silver tray, which she was turning over as if one side might reveal more than the other. Julian saw her at once. He did not turn sharply or betray alarm. That would have given Clarissa a victory she had not yet earned. He merely shifted, just enough that his body altered the angle of the room, and said in an even tone, "Your conservatory appears to have acquired an audience." Clarissa pushed open the door with her prettiest smile already in place. The warm smell of damp soil moved around her skirts as she entered. "Forgive me. I was sent to ask whether the Duke prefers tea or coffee." She lifted the calling card between two fingers. "And I found this on the tray. I thought it ought not to be mislaid." "Your concern is touching," Cecily said. It was the first sharp thing she had said to her cousin in years. Clarissa's smile did not vanish, but it stiffened at the edges. She set the card on a little iron table beside a pot of half-dead rosemary and looked from one to the other with bold curiosity. "One can hardly help being concerned," she said. "Such a whirlwind understanding invites admiration and questions." Julian spared her one cool glance. "Then I recommend admiration. Questions are tiring." Cecily had to lower her eyes for fear the ghost of amusement on her face might be seen. Clarissa, however, was not a woman easily dismissed. She lingered another breath too long, then another, and at last withdrew only because to remain would have exposed the hunger beneath her politeness. When the door shut behind her, the hush in the conservatory deepened. "She will not rest," Cecily said quietly. "No," Julian answered. "She has caught the scent of disorder." He moved to the small table, picked up his card, and slipped it into his pocket. That simple act, neat, controlled, faintly protective, stuck her more than it should have done. She was beginning to recognize that much of what he did was careful by nature. He gave nothing away carelessly, not words, not glances, not promises. If affection ever came from such a man, it would not arrive in a flood. It would come in measured, deliberate offerings. That thought was dangerous. She pushed it aside. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "my mother hears of you before someone else tells her badly." The words changed the air at once. She had thought so much of her own household that his had remained, until now, a distant territory beyond the map. But of course it existed. A dowager duchess, relations, a sister perhaps, or cousins of his own, servants who had seen ladies come and go under the old expectation that one day their duke would make a glittering match. Cecily felt suddenly, keenly, how little she belonged in that imagined world. "She will hate me." "That is possible." The bluntness of it startled a small laugh from her before she could stop it. Julian looked almost apologetic. "I do not mean to alarm you, only to be honest." "And honesty is your chosen cruelty?" "No." His voice lowered. "My chosen courtesy." That should not have moved her, and yet it did. More than flattery would have done, more than any practiced sweetness. Neither spoke. Sunlight, weak and watery through the dusty glass, caught in the dark strands of his hair. Somewhere beyond, her mother's voice rose in overbright excitement. A teacup clinked. The world was already rearranging itself around them. At length he said, "There is another matter. Society will expect signs." "Signs?" "Notes, flowers, calls, attention." His expression grew faintly dry. "A public engagement requires visible nourishment, or else people begin to count the gaps." Cecily understood at once. The illusion could not simply be declared. It must be fed, observed, repeated until it hardened into fact in other people's minds. She thought of Clarissa in doorways, of Imogen with her listening silences, of every lady in town waiting to see whether a duke's interest in the spinster of Marlow Street would survive a second morning. "I see," she said. "Then we must give them something to see." His eyes met hers fully then, and there was the strangest look in them. Respect, perhaps, and a flicker of something warmer, gone before she could name it. "Yes," he said, "we must." A footman tapped at the glass and announced that Lady Aldermore's carriage had arrived at the square unexpectedly that very moment, and the Duke's mother was even now being shown into the drawing-room. For a moment, neither of them moved. The footman had withdrawn the instant he delivered the message, leaving the words behind like a dropped tray. Cecily felt the blood go cool in her hands. Through the dusty panes, she could just make out the front sweep of the street beyond the house, the blurred shape of a dark carriage at the curb, the glossy flank of a horse tossing rein from its mane. Somewhere inside, in the drawing-room, her mother was no doubt fluttering into a panic, her uncle inflating himself with borrowed importance, Clarissa tasting the moment like sugar on her tongue. Julian's expression altered in the slightest degree. It did not crack, but it sharpened. "My mother is rarely unexpected," he said. "That alone is troubling." "Shall I hide among the geraniums?" Cecily asked. It was a poor attempt at levity, but it succeeded in drawing from him one brief look that was almost warm. "No, if you retreat now, she will smell fear for the rest of the season." "And if I stay?" "She will smell independence, which she dislikes nearly as much." They crossed the passage together. The house seemed to listen as they walked. Every board gave a careful little complaint underfoot. Every servant they passed became suddenly intent upon some meaningless object. By the time they reached the drawing-room door, Cecily had time only to smooth her hands once over her skirt and lift her chin. Lady Aldermore stood by the fireplace, as if the room had been arranged for her convenience decades before and had simply been waiting for the courtesy to continue. She was not a large woman, yet presence clung to her with almost military authority. Her gown was dove-gray silk, trimmed in jet, severe and expensive. Her face, still handsome in its older lines, had the composed hardness of someone long obeyed. She held her gloves in one hand and a folded calling card in the other, though there was no need. The room itself already knew who she was. Her gaze moved first to Julian, then to Cecily, and remained there. Worse than rude. Precise. "Mother," Julian said with formal calm, "may I present Miss Cecily Dean?" Lady Aldermore inclined her head. "So this is Miss Dean." Cecily curtsied. The movement felt oddly distant from her body, as if she were watching some other young woman perform it. The dowager did not ask to sit. She took the chair nearest the hearth because it was the seat of command, and only then allowed the rest of the room to settle around her. Mrs. Dean, trying and failing to appear natural, murmured something about tea. Mr. Dean offered awkward pleasantries. Clarissa and Imogen had somehow found reason to remain. Julian stayed standing near Cecily's shoulder, not touching her, not crowding her, yet unmistakably there. "I was informed," Lady Aldermore said at last, "within the hour that my son had become engaged. As he had neglected to send that information himself, I thought it prudent to verify whether rumor had suffered another attack of imagination." The words were smooth, but their edge was keen. Julian answered before anyone else could stumble. "The engagement is true." "I see." Her eyes returned to Cecily. "And Miss Dean finds the matter equally true?" There it was. The test laid in public, yet meant for one woman alone. Cecily knew very well what was being weighed. Not merely her breeding, though that too. Her composure. Her nerve. Whether she would wilt, babble, blush, or cling. Whether she had trapped a duke through tears or ambition. Whether the spinster of Marlow Street possessed any substance once examined under a colder light. "I do, madam," she said. Lady Aldermore studied her another long second. Then she accepted the teacup Mrs. Dean nearly rattled into its saucer and asked, with chilling mildness, "How long have you and my son been conducting this understanding without my knowledge?" Julian began to answer, but his mother lifted one gloved finger. "No, Julian, I asked Miss Dean." The room seemed to contract around the question. Cecily could hear the faint hiss of the fire, the porcelain rattle in its saucer where her mother's hand had not yet gone still, the whisper of Clarissa's sleeve as she leaned a fraction nearer. Lady Aldermore had chosen her ground perfectly. If Cecily stumbled, the stumble would be remembered. If she blushed, the blush would be interpreted. If she looked to Julian for rescue, dependence would be written across her like ink. So she kept her eyes on the older woman and answered with the truth, though not the whole of it. "Not long enough to justify such abruptness in your hearing of it," she said. For that I beg your pardon, but long enough for me to be certain I would not withdraw my consent once it was asked." Silence followed. It was only the strange steadiness that sometimes comes after fear has climbed to its highest point and finds there is nowhere else to go. Lady Aldermore did not soften, yet something in her expression changed, just slightly, as if she had expected either simpering gratitude or flustered evasions and had been denied both. Julian spoke then. "The delay was mine." His mother turned her head. "Naturally, Mother." Just that. One word spoken low, a warning wrapped in perfect manners. Cecily felt rather than saw the shift in him. He had been reserved before. Now he was alert, guarding. Lady Aldermore set down her untouched tea. "You do realize," she said to Cecily, "that my son's choices are rarely private for long. An engagement to him is not a matter of one drawing-room and a florist's bill. It becomes public property before the week is out." "I have already discovered as much," Cecily replied. That earned her the faintest curve at one corner of Julian's mouth, gone almost before it formed. The dowager's gaze moved over the modest room, the faded curtains, the careful polish on furniture past its first bloom. She did not sneer. A woman of her breeding had no need of obvious contempt. She conveyed whole judgments with a glance at a hem, a pause over a mantel clock, a fraction too much stillness after another person spoke. And yet, for all that, Cecily sensed something unexpected beneath the scrutiny. Concern. Possessive, controlling, coldly expressed concern, but genuine in its fashion. At last Lady Aldermore rose. "I have heard enough for one call," she said. Mrs. Dean stood so quickly she nearly upset the tea-table altogether. Mr. Dean began murmuring assurances that the family was deeply honored, extremely sensible, entirely grateful. Clarissa looked disappointed. She had hoped, quite plainly, for greater carnage. Then the dowager did a remarkable thing. She stepped towards Cecily herself. From a distance, Lady Aldermore's severity had seemed almost ornamental, like the edge on a ceremonial blade. Up close, it was sharper. Her perfume was dry and expensive, with a trace of violet and something colder beneath. She studied Cecily's face once more, this time without any audience in the angle of her attention, though half the room still watched. "You are very calm, Miss Dean," she said. "I am trying to be useful, madam." The words escaped before Cecily could weigh them. They were too revealing, too near the wound. Something flashed in the older woman's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or the memory of some private history. It vanished at once. "See that you are not merely convenient," she said quietly, so that only Cecily and Julian could hear. Then she offered her hand for Cecily to touch in leave-taking. It was neither welcome nor blessing, but it was not refusal either. When she had gone, the house exploded into motion again. Her mother wept afresh, this time from relief at surviving the encounter. Her uncle began speaking grandly of announcements, as though he had arranged the entire affair himself. Imogen whispered behind a fan. Clarissa disappeared for nearly half an hour and returned too composed, which meant she had been thinking. Julian remained only long enough to settle what propriety required. Before he left, he asked if he might send books, as Cecily had once mentioned a fondness for poetry. It was such an ordinary question that Mrs. Dean nearly smiled through her tears. Cecily, however, understood at once that nothing between them could be ordinary now. Not flowers, not notes, not books, especially not books. Because as Julian crossed the hall toward the door, Clarissa was standing near the umbrella stand, turning over in her gloved hands the little catalogue Cecily had brought back from the circulating library the day she went to meet him. And inside it, half hidden between the pages, was Mr. Pritchard's receipt with his office address plainly written across the top. Cecily saw the danger before anyone else did. It was the smallest thing in the world, a narrow paper slip caught between the catalog pages, no larger than a glove button card, and yet it seemed to flare before her eyes. Mr. Pritchard's name, his office direction, the quiet, ugly bridge between her borrowed outing and the arrangement that must never be examined too closely. Clarissa was holding it carelessly, almost lazily, but there was nothing lazy in the brightness of her gaze. Cecily crossed the hall at once. "You have my library list," she said, extending her hand. Clarissa smiled and did not surrender it immediately. "Do I? I thought I had only discovered your sudden devotion to improving literature." "Then discover also that it is not yours." The edge in Cecily's voice brought a flicker of surprise. Clarissa let the catalog fall into her cousin's hand, though not before her eyes dipped once more to the slip inside. One look was enough for a woman like her. She missed nothing that could later be sharpened. Julian, still at the threshold, had turned slightly back. His expression did not alter, but she knew he had seen at least that something had passed between them. He took his leave a moment later with perfect composure, and if his bow to Mrs. Dean was measured and proper, his glance to Cecily asked a question he could not speak aloud in that hall. "Are you safe?" She did not know. By evening the house had become unbearable. Congratulations arrived with such speed that they felt less like kindness than inspection. Notes on cream paper, cards edged in gilt. One basket of white roses from a lady who had once excluded Cecily from a musicale because the party was quite full. Her mother moved through it all as if walking in a dream. Mr. Dean had discovered pride. Imogen grew sugary. Clarissa grew thoughtful, which was far worse. At supper, she was all innocence. "How strange," she said, spreading marmalade over toast she did not need, "that a circulating library should lead to such fortunate consequences. I had never known books to be quite so practical." Cecily set down her spoon. "One learns new things every day." "And solicitors too, it seems." The teacup in Mrs. Dean's hand struck its saucer. It was very slight, that line. So slight that a less nervous listener might have missed it. But Cecily did not miss it. Neither, she thought, did Imogen, whose lashes flew up at once. Clarissa lowered her eyes with an expression of bland surprise, as though she herself had not known what she meant until the words were spoken. Mr. Dean frowned. "What solicitors?" "Oh, none of consequence. I only thought I glimpsed a tradesman's receipt among Cecily's papers. Perhaps I was mistaken." "You were," Cecily said. Clarissa accepted that answer with suspicious ease. That was what chilled her most. Not the jab itself, but the retreat. It meant her cousin was not aiming for a breakfast quarrel. She was storing something. The next morning brought another kind of disturbance. A parcel arrived just after 10, carried in by a footman from Aldermore House. It was long and flat, tied with dark green ribbon, and bore no flourish beyond Cecily's name written in a firm masculine hand. Her mother watched while she untied it, trying and failing to appear uninterested. Inside lay 3 books, a small volume of Cowper, a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, and a travel journal filled with engravings of ruined abbeys and old estates, the sort of book one reads for mood as much as for content. Only a folded card fell out. I thought these might endure repeated handling better than flowers. J.A. Such a plain message, such a careful one. Yet the selection itself felt startlingly intimate. Not because it was romantic in the usual fashion, but because it suggested he had listened. That somewhere inside all the machinery of their false understanding, Julian had remembered what sort of pages she liked beneath her fingers. Her mother sighed over the books. Imogen sighed over the handwriting. Clarissa said nothing at all. That silence lasted until half an hour later, when Cecily, passing the back window, saw her cousin in bonnet and gloves slipping out through the garden gate alone, and turning, not toward Bond Street or any visiting call, but toward the lane that led in the direction of Mr. Pritchard's office. Cecily did not stop to think. She was already moving before the garden gate had finished swinging behind Clarissa. The back path was slick with yesterday's rain, and the hem of her dress gathered damp at once. She caught up her skirts in one hand and crossed the narrow yard with far less grace than urgency, the gravel biting through the soles of her shoes. Beyond the gate, the lane bent between brick walls, stained dark by weather. Clarissa was ahead of her, walking quickly, not at all like a lady out for air. Her bonnet ribbons snapped in the breeze. She did not look back. "Clarissa?" The name left Cecily's mouth sharper than she intended. Her cousin slowed, then turned with visible annoyance. "How breathless you are," Clarissa said. "If you continue to run through lanes, you will quite ruin the romance of your engagement." "You are going to Mr. Pritchard?" Clarissa widened her eyes. "Am I?" "You know perfectly well you are." For a second the mask slipped. Something bright and ugly showed through. "Then suppose I am. What of it?" The lane smelled of wet stone, horse dung from the mews beyond, and the faint metallic tang of recent rain. A cart rattled distantly on the main road. Cecily stood facing her cousin and realized with a strange clarity that they had never truly spoken plainly before. Everything between them had always been wrapped in family phrases, smiles, and the small permissions cruelty grants itself indoors. "What do you want?" she asked. Clarissa laughed once, softly. "At last, an honest question. Shall I answer honestly? I want to know how a woman everybody had finished with contrived to become a duchess-in-waiting between breakfast and supper. I want to know why a reclusive duke appeared at your uncle's house as if summoned by design. And I want to know what business you had with a solicitor the very day your engagement was declared." The words landed hard because there was so much accuracy in them. Cecily felt her heart stumble, then steady. "You make everything sound sordid because you cannot bear anything you did not arrange yourself. And you make everything sound noble because that is easier than admitting you have been clever." They stood there in the cold lane like two women in a much poorer kind of duel, neither armed except by knowledge and nerve. Cecily saw then that jealousy was only half of Clarissa's motive. The other half was panic. Clarissa had built herself on a simple belief that the world rewarded glitter, confidence, and appetite. Cecily's engagement offended that belief down to its roots. "If you go to that office," Cecily said, more quietly now, "you will injure more than me." Clarissa's smile thinned. "If there is nothing there, no injury can follow." That was the trap. Innocence should not fear inquiry. Respectability should welcome it. Cecily could not forbid the visit without making it more meaningful, so she changed her ground. "You are forgetting one thing," she said. "If you meddle in the affairs of the Duke of Aldermore and are discovered, society will not call you spirited, it will call you vulgar." Clarissa's eyes flashed. The arrow had struck. For all her boldness, she lived on the approval of the very drawing rooms she pretended to master. To be cut by them would wound more deeply than any scolding at home. Still, she did not retreat. Instead, she took one step nearer and lowered her voice. "Then perhaps I shall be discreet. Perhaps I shall ask no questions at all. Perhaps I shall only observe whether your handsome duke has papers hidden where papers ought not to be." A chill went through Cecily that had nothing to do with the weather. Clarissa had not guessed the shape of the truth, not yet, but she had guessed there were papers. From the main road came the sudden clatter of another carriage drawing up. Both women turned instinctively. At the far end of the lane, just visible between the brick walls, A groom in Aldermore livery was climbing down from the box with a sealed note in his hand, and it was addressed to Miss Cecily Dean. The groom touched his hat and came no farther down the lane than good manners allowed. His boots were wet to the ankle, and the dark green cuff of his coat was spattered with road mud. In his gloved hand lay a small folded note sealed in black wax with the Aldermore crest pressed deep and clean. Clarissa saw it at the same instant Cecily did. That was the misery of such moments. One never faced danger alone. One faced it with witnesses. "For Miss Dean," the groom said. Cecily stepped forward before her cousin could speak. "Yes?" Clarissa's smile returned at once, softer now, more dangerous for the softness. "How very prompt your Duke is. One would almost think he feared being left out of family conversation." Cecily ignored her and broke the seal with colder fingers than she liked to admit. The paper inside smelled faintly of sanded ink and cedar from a writing desk. Julian's hand was brief and unmistakable. "Pritchard requests I ask whether any member of your household has called upon him or made inquiry. If so, send me answer by this man at once. Speak cautiously." That was all. No tenderness, no waste. Only alarm reduced to clean lines. Cecily read it twice, then folded it shut with care. When she looked up, Clarissa was watching her face, searching for meaning there. "Well?" her cousin asked. "A matter of books," Cecily said. Clarissa gave a low laugh. "You and your books. They have become astonishingly useful of late." The groom waited with the patient stillness of a servant trained to hear nothing and observe much. Cecily knew she had only seconds to choose. She could lie and send back denial. She could confess her suspicion and risk everything reaching Julian through written words carried by another man. Or she could do what she had not done often enough in her life, trust her own quickness. She turned to Clarissa with sudden calm. "If you intend to go farther down this lane, cousin, do so. But understand me clearly. Should my fiancé learn that you have put his solicitor under examination, he will assume you mean to injure me, and if he assumes that, he will not forgive it." The name of the solicitor was deliberate. She saw the tiny flare in Clarissa's eyes. Caught. Not fully, but enough. A heartbeat passed. Then Clarissa drew herself up and gave the prettiest little shrug. "You credit me with a great deal of energy. I was only walking." She turned on her heel with a rustle of skirts and began moving back toward the garden gate, though not without adding over one shoulder, "Do be careful, Cecily. Sudden fortune makes people clumsy." Cecily watched until she was gone inside. Only then did she exhale. She took the footman's pencil from the groom, turned Julian's note over, and wrote in the smallest hand she could manage. She was going toward him. She may suspect papers. I stopped her, but not her curiosity. The groom took the reply, bowed, and left at once. Hooves struck the stones beyond the lane. The sound faded quickly. Cecily went back through the garden slower than she had come out. The air had turned colder. Damp box leaves brushed her sleeve. Inside the house, everything felt too bright, too domestic, too innocent of what had just nearly happened. Her mother was in the breakfast room, arranging the 3 books on a side table as if they were already family relics. Imogen was trimming ribbon. Clarissa had resumed her seat by the window and was sewing with such calm exactness that anyone else might have thought the lane scene imagined. That false calm lasted until nearly 4 o'clock. At 10 minutes before the hour, another carriage rolled up to the front of Marlow Street. This one did not bear a servant with a note. Julian himself stepped down, and the moment Cecily saw his face through the drawing-room glass, she knew something had shifted. He was too composed, and when the maid announced him, he asked for Miss Dean alone. That request sent a visible ripple through the house. Mrs. Dean looked up from her embroidery with startled hope as if private conversation between betrothed people must surely mean tenderness and nothing more dangerous. Imogen's brows flew upward. Clarissa, who had been slicing an apple into perfect pale crescents, set down the knife with exaggerated calm. Only Cecily, seeing Julian's face through the half-open door, understood that this was not a lover's impulse. It was strategy and haste. Her mother, blessingly, did not delay them. "Of course," she said at once. "The morning room is empty." Julian bowed. He waited until the door had shut behind them before he spoke. The room smelled faintly of beeswax and the lemon oil the maid used on the little escritoire. Rain tapped against the window panes again, soft but insistent. Cecily stood near the mantel. He did not come close. "Clarissa went to the office," he said. "Yes, I stopped her in the lane." His jaw tightened very slightly. Pritchard sent his clerk to the front room and refused all information. She gave a false name, then another. When that failed, she pretended she had come on behalf of your uncle regarding a family matter. He exhaled once, controlled and quiet. She is not subtle, but she is persistent. Cecily felt the room go colder around her. Did she see anything? No, not there. His eyes lifted to hers. But Pritchard now believes we have little time before curiosity turns inventive. The words settled heavily between them. Little time. Until now, the danger had come in glimpses, overheard questions, a receipt, a glance too sharp. This was the first moment it felt organized, deliberate. "What must we do?" she asked. His answer came at once. He had already decided it. "We hasten what society would expect slowly. More calls, more visible attention, a formal supper at my mother's house within the week, and a betrothal ball at Aldermore House before the month is out." Cecily stared at him. "A ball?" "Yes." "That is not haste. That is spectacle." "It is protection." He paced once toward the window, then turned back. "If the engagement becomes large enough, public enough, invested with enough witness, any private doubt will have to fight against what the entire town has already accepted. People are cowards in groups. They will cling to the larger story." She almost laughed at the grim practicality of it. "You make society sound like weather." "It is worse. Weather does not pretend to have principles." A tiny, unwilling smile pulled at her mouth and vanished. He saw it. Something eased in his expression for the span of a breath, and then the tension returned. "There is more," he said. Of course there was. There was always more. "My sister has returned to town." Cecily knew at once from his tone that this mattered. "Is she allied with your mother?" "She is allied with influence, which is often the same thing." He paused, as if choosing fairness over irritation. "Rosamond dislikes surprises, and I have given her one." Cecily moved to the chair by the fire, but did not sit. Her hands were cold despite the heat in the room. "Then your mother disapproves. Your sister will pry. My cousins sniff at every door. And your answer is to invite all of them into one room under chandeliers?" "My answer," he said more softly, "is to stand beside you where everyone can see it." The simplicity of that shook her more than the plan itself. She had entered this bargain to avoid disappearance. He had entered it to gain time. Yet here he was, not speaking like a man protecting only his own convenience, but like one who had quietly taken her burden onto his shoulders and meant to carry it in public. It would have been safer if he had remained merely efficient, safer for both of them. "And if public standing does not suffice?" she asked. His gaze held hers. Gray, steady, unreadable to everyone else perhaps, but no longer unreadable to her. There was fatigue there, resolve, and beneath both something warmer she dared not examine too closely. Then we shall have to become very convincing indeed. Before she could answer, voices rose in the passage. One was her mother's, one belonged unmistakably to Clarissa, and the third, female, cool, aristocratic, and edged like glass, could only be Lady Rosamond Ashcombe. She had arrived without warning, and she was asking, in tones no servant could possibly mistake, to see the woman who meant to marry her brother. Julian closed his eyes for the briefest instant, as if his sister's timing offended some private, exacting sense of order. Then he opened them again, and the expression was gone. "Rosamond never asks to see a person," he said. "She inspects a position." Cecily ought to have been frightened by that. She was frightened, but there was something in his dry tone that steadied her, even as it warned her. Outside the morning room, the voices in the passage rose and fell, silk brushing woodwork, a servant murmuring apology, her mother fluttering in that over-polite way she adopted when alarmed. The whole house seemed too small for so many forces gathering in it. "Shall I expect to be weighed, measured, and found wanting?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "but not by any standard worth respecting." The answer struck her harder than comfort would have done. Before she could speak, he reached into his coat and drew out a folded sheet. The paper was thick, cream-colored, and creased once across the middle. He did not hand it to her immediately. "This is the invitation draft for the ball," he said. "I had not meant to show it to you yet. Now I think you ought to see the shape of what is coming." He placed it on the table between them. At the top, in careful script, stood the formal language of a great house inviting half the season to celebrate the betrothal of the Duke of Aldermore and Miss Cecily Dean. The sight of her own name written so grandly made something inside her turn over. It was only ink, and yet it felt as if a stranger had stepped into her life wearing her face. "Aldermore House," she murmured. "In 3 weeks. That soon? That late, if we are unlucky." He let that settle. Then, more quietly, "If my sister means mischief, she will begin with servants, with letters, with little discrepancies in household accounts. She collects details the way other women collect compliments." Cecily looked up sharply. "Then why bring me into her reach at all?" "Because if I keep you hidden, they will imagine reasons. If I place you in full light, they must contend with what everyone sees." There it was again. His whole strategy rested on visibility, on putting their fiction before the world until the world defended it out of sheer habit. It was audacious, it was dangerous, and it required her to do the one thing society had denied her for years: be seen. A knock came, precise. Julian took back the invitation, folded it once, and slipped it into her hand. "Keep that, read it later, and whatever Rosamond asks, answer plainly. She dislikes ornament almost as much as I do." The door opened before Cecily could reply. Lady Rosamond Ashcombe entered as if she had every right to every room she crossed. She was younger than her brother, taller than Cecily by an inch or two, and dressed in deep blue silk cut with severe elegance. Beauty sat on her more coldly than it did on Clarissa. There was no flutter in it, no softness. Her face was all fine lines and intelligence, sharpened by a mouth that rarely looked surprised and never looked kind without intention. "Julian," she said. "Rosamond?" Her gaze moved to Cecily and remained there. If Lady Aldermore had examined, Rosamond appraised. One could almost hear the inner calculations: background, poise, threat, utility. "Miss Dean," she said, "at last." Cecily inclined her head. "Lady Rosamond?" For one suspended moment, the two women merely looked at one another. Then Rosamond smiled, and that was somehow worse than if she had not. "My brother," she said, removing one glove, finger by finger, "has always been difficult to surprise. So you may imagine my curiosity." Julian's tone cooled a degree. You did not come here for curiosity. No, Rosamond said. I came because Mother sent me home with a headache, and because within the hour 3 different people informed me that my brother is either in love, in rebellion, or in trouble. I should like to know which. Cecily felt the folded invitation in her palm like a live thing. Julian answered first. You need know only that my engagement stands. Rosamond did not look at him. That was not addressed to you. Then very deliberately she turned to Cecily and said, Tell me, Miss Dean, when a man who has refused every suitable woman in England suddenly chooses one no one expected, should his family call it romance, or should they call for a solicitor? Rosamond's question landed with the elegance of a knife laid on linen. No one raised a voice. No one needed to. The insult was too polished for vulgarity. Cecily felt it in the stillness that followed, in the fire settling behind the grate, in the faint smell of rain drying on Julian's coat, in the pressure of the folded invitation still hidden in her palm. He had gone very still beside her. She knew without looking that he was ready to end the interview if she wished it. But if he dismissed his sister now, Rosamond would take the dismissal as proof. So Cecily answered, I think, she said, that families often call for solicitors when they are frightened, and for romance when they are proud. Neither word alters the truth of what has been chosen. Rosamond's brows lifted the smallest fraction. She had expected evasion. She expected embarrassment. What she had not expected, apparently, was to be answered as one adult might answer another. And what is it, she asked, that has been chosen? Julian stepped in then, his tone cool. Enough. His sister did not look at him. No, not enough. You vanish from every sensible plan laid before you, refuse every woman presented, allow Mother to suffer a dozen humiliations on your behalf, and then appear with an engagement no one has seen forming. I am entitled to ask whether this is devotion or defiance. That word moved through the room like a draft. Defiance. Cecily almost smiled at the cruel accuracy of it, though not in the way Rosamond meant. This whole strange bond had begun in defiance on both their parts, yet that was no longer the whole of it. Somewhere between the solicitor's back room and the books on her table, something quieter and more dangerous had begun to grow. Julian's voice dropped. You are entitled to good manners in this house, Rosamond. Exercise them. She turned at last and looked directly at her brother. What passed between them then was not sibling irritation, but a much older conflict. Habit. Power. The stale ache of long family battles fought with civility instead of shouting. Cecily saw that Julian's reserve had not come from nowhere. It had been shaped here, in rooms just like this, by women who knew how to love through control and men who preferred silence to contest. Rosamond removed the other glove slowly. Very well, she said. Let us have good manners. Miss Dean, will you do us the honor of dining at Aldermore House this Thursday? Mother wishes the family to receive you properly before the invitations are issued. It was a challenge dressed as courtesy. Cecily heard it at once. A dinner was smaller than a ball, sharper, more intimate, easier to manage, easier to test a woman under a dozen watchful eyes, easier, perhaps, to make her fail. Julian said, That is unnecessary. Rosamond's mouth curved. On the contrary, unless, of course, your fiancé is unwilling. There it was again, another trap. Refuse, and she would seem frightened. Accept, and she stepped straight into the Ashcombe stronghold before she had learned where the doors were. Cecily looked at Julian then, only a glance. He gave her no signal, no rescuing answer. And oddly, that steadied her more than anything else could have done. He was allowing her choice to remain her own. I shall be happy to come, she said. Rosamond inclined her head as if a move on a game board had been acknowledged. Excellent. The interview ended soon after that, though not because the tension eased. Mrs. Dean was summoned in again. Polite phrases resumed. Rosamond took tea and scarcely touched it. Julian remained until his sister rose to leave, and when they were finally alone for one brief moment in the hall, he said quietly, "You need not have agreed." She meant to make refusal a confession. Yes. And acceptance? He looked at her with that grave, unreadable steadiness she was beginning to know too well. Acceptance means she has invited you onto ground she believes she controls. The door closed behind his sister a minute later. The house exhaled. Clarissa appeared almost at once from nowhere, as though she'd been listening through wood and wallpaper both. She took one look at Cecily's face and smiled. "A family dinner at Aldermore House," she said. "How very swift." One might think they are eager to know whether the spinster of Marlow Street can keep her footing on polished floors. Cecily did not answer. She was thinking of Thursday, of Rosamond's eyes, of Julian's warning, and of the note that arrived just before dusk, carried not by a groom this time, but by one of Aldermore's upper servants, sealed in the dowager's own hand. Inside was a single line. "Tell Miss Dean to wear blue. It will be less disappointing." The note lay in Cecily's hand like a gloved slap. The paper itself was costly, thick beneath her fingers, scented faintly with iris and starch. The handwriting was firm, elegant, and mercilessly controlled. "Tell Miss Dean to wear blue. It will be less disappointing." Her mother, who had read the line over Cecily's shoulder before decency could stop her, let out a little sound of distress. "Oh, how odd," Mrs. Dean whispered. "Perhaps she means it kindly." "No," Cecily said. She did not say it with heat. That was what made it truer. Lady Aldermore had not sent fashion advice. She had sent a warning, and worse than a warning, a measurement. Blue because it would soften her. Blue because it would recede. Blue because pale girls in quiet colors did not threaten old houses and older expectations. Blue, perhaps, because disappointment was already assumed, only to be managed. Clarissa, when she heard of the note, smiled in that bright cat-like way of hers. "How thoughtful. They are dressing you before they have even installed you." Cecily folded the paper once, then again, and tucked it into her work-box without a word. But that night, long after the lamps were lowered and Marlow Street had gone still, she opened the lid again and read the line by candlelight until the letters blurred. She should have felt insulted. She did feel insulted. Yet beneath it ran another sensation harder to confess. Fear. She had survived ridicule. Fear of entering a house so practiced in power that every napkin fold and seating choice might be turned into a judgment. The next afternoon brought Julian. He was shown into the smaller drawing room, where the winter light made the wallpaper look faded and kind. He did not sit at once. "My mother sent a note," he said. "She did." "And you received it?" Cecily almost laughed at the uselessness of the question. "I did not imagine it." A shadow crossed his face. "I am sorry." That, strangely, softened her more than any defense might have done, because he did not excuse his family. He looked genuinely wearied by them, as if each fresh act of their management cost him something he was already tired of paying. "She wishes to diminish me," Cecily said. "Yes." He answered so directly that she turned toward him fully. He had taken off his gloves and was rolling one between his fingers, an absent gesture she had begun to recognize as a sign of strain. "Then why am I still going?" she asked. "Because if you refuse now, Rosamond will call it retreat and my mother will call it instinct. They will both be pleased with themselves." His gaze lifted to hers. "And because I do not wish them pleased." That ought not to have warmed her. It did, a little. He reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out something wrapped in brown paper. "I brought this." Inside was a book, not poetry this time, a slim volume bound in worn green leather, the edges rubbed pale with use. When she opened it, she saw notes in the margin in a hand she now knew at once for his own, sketches of facades, underlined phrases, a pressed fern, long flattened between pages. "My copy of Plutarch?" she asked, startled. "You said once that you prefer books already lived in. I thought—" He stopped, almost impatient with himself. "I thought it might be company before Thursday." Something in her chest shifted. No grand declaration could have pierced her more neatly than that simple offering. A man who guarded himself so closely had handed her not a jewel, not a bouquet, but the evidence of his private mind. "Thank you," she said, and meant it too much. For a moment the room grew very quiet. He stood close enough now that she could catch the clean scent of starch and cold air from his coat, the faint trace of sandalwood soap. She looked down at the book again because looking at him had become unexpectedly difficult. When he spoke, his voice had changed. "If they are unkind at dinner," he said, "you may leave the table on any excuse. You do not owe endurance to my household." "And if I do leave, what then?" "Then I leave with you." She looked up at that. Their eyes met, and whatever had begun between them in calculation and necessity trembled there on the edge of becoming something more dangerous, something neither of them had named. He seemed to realize it at the same instant she did, because he stepped back almost at once, the moment closing like a hand. He cleared his throat. "Wear whatever color you please, Cecily." It was the first time he had said her name without formality. He left shortly after. She stood by the window watching his carriage disappear into the dusk, the green book clasped against her ribs. When she turned back to the room, the candle on the writing desk had burned low, and beside it lay an envelope the maid must have brought in while they were speaking. No seal, no signature. Inside was a single scrap torn from another paper in a clerk's neat hand. "To be dissolved by mutual consent when both parties are freed from family interference." Cecily stared at the line until the floor seemed to tilt beneath her. Someone, somewhere, had found the first words of the contract. For a few seconds, Cecily could not feel her fingers. The scrap lay on the desk beside the guttering candle, innocent as any torn memorandum, and yet every word on it burned. "To be dissolved by mutual consent when both parties are freed from family interference." She knew the line, knew the clerk's neat hand, knew, with a cold certainty that hollowed her from the ribs outward, that this was no guess, no clever slander, no cousin's invention. Someone had seen the paper itself, or one of its copies. She rang for no maid. She called for no comfort. Instead, she crossed to the bell pull and asked the footman, in as steady a voice as she could manage, whether the Aldermore carriage had gone far. It had not. A groom was sent. A note was written in haste, the nib catching twice on the paper because her hand would not quite obey her. "Come back at once. It is about the agreement." She sealed it without signing. Julian returned within half an hour. He came in still wearing his evening coat, the damp night clinging to the hem, a single drop of rain bright on one dark lock of hair. The servants were dismissed before questions could breed. In the little morning room, with the door shut and the candle throwing uncertain shadows across the wallpaper, Cecily placed the torn line in his hand and watched his face as he read. All color left it. He did not ask where it came from first. He knew better. He read it once, then a second time, then lifted his eyes to hers. "This is from Pritchard's copy." "Not yours?" He reached at once inside his coat and drew out a folded packet, still sealed beneath his own private wafer. "Mine is intact." Relief came and went so quickly it barely counted. One copy safe did not matter if another had been touched. Cecily sat because her knees had begun to tremble. The room smelled of warm wax and rain drying on wool. Somewhere in the house her mother laughed too brightly at something downstairs, innocent still of disaster. "Then someone has been inside his office," she whispered. "Yes." He said nothing else, only stood with the scrap between his fingers as if it might yield a name by pressure alone. When he did speak, his voice was quieter than before, more dangerous for the quiet. "Rosamond asked whether the family should call for a solicitor," he said. "Clarissa tried the office. A clerk there has loose habits and debts. Pritchard mentioned him once." His mouth hardened. "This may be curiosity. It may be purchase." The thought made her feel briefly ill. He knelt then, only because she was seated and he wished to meet her eyes without towering over her, and laid the scrap on the table between them. The gesture was so simple, so untheatrical, that it undid her more than urgency might have done. "Listen to me," he said. "Whatever this becomes, you will not face it alone." She believed him. That was the terrifying part. Not because prudence advised belief, but because some deeper, more reckless portion of her already trusted the man before her beyond reason. "What do we do?" she asked. "We go to Pritchard at first light." Morning came gray and raw. The city smelled of wet stone and coal smoke. Julian's carriage took them by a side route, curtained against observation, and the stationer's dull brass plate looked even more cheerless than before. Mr. Pritchard received them in the same back room, though today the coal fire had gone nearly out, and his face seemed 10 years older. Before either of them could speak, he shut the door, drew a key from his pocket, and said, "I was about to send for you both." Cecily's pulse lurched. Pritchard went to the strong-box, opened it, and turned back with empty hands. "The duplicate," he said, each word clipped with professional shame, "is gone." For a moment, the words did not seem to belong to any language Cecily knew. Gone. The duplicate was gone. Mr. Pritchard stood before them with the open strong-box at his elbow, its iron mouth black and empty, the cold office light falling over ledgers, sealing wax, and the terrible neatness of a room where order had just been violated. Outside, the rain ticked faintly against the narrow window. Somewhere in the front office, a clerk shifted his weight and then went still again. Julian moved first. "When?" he asked. Pritchard drew a breath that sounded almost painful. "Sometime yesterday afternoon, I believe. I did not discover it at once because the packet itself had been returned to the lower shelf with other settlement papers. My junior clerk, Henshaw, failed to report that a key had been mislaid for 2 hours. He says he found it again beneath the copying desk. I no longer believe he found anything by accident." "And Henshaw?" Julian asked. "Dismissed at dawn." Pritchard's mouth tightened. "He is absent from his lodging." That, more than anything, gave the theft a body. A man with ink on his fingers and debts at his heels had touched the terms of her future and carried them into the world. Cecily spoke because silence felt like drowning. "Then someone paid him." Pritchard did not soften it for her. "That is my view." Julian turned from the strongbox and came to stand beside her chair. He did not touch her, but the warmth of his presence cut through the office chill. "Who knew there was a duplicate here?" "Only myself, Henshaw by necessity, and perhaps—" Pritchard stopped. "Say it," Julian said. The solicitor's eyes flickered once toward Cecily, then back. "Perhaps any sufficiently observant person who saw us drafting more than one copy, and who later chose to ask the right sort of questions." "Clarissa." Rosamond, Lady Aldermore. Even the phrase felt poisonous now. Cecily remembered her cousin in the lane, that bright, hungry look, and then Rosamond's cool talk of solicitors. They might not have stolen it with their own hands. They might only have nudged, hinted, paid, permitted. Sometimes that was worse. "What can they do with it?" Cecily asked. Pritchard's answer came too quickly. He had been thinking on nothing else. "If they possess the full document, they can attempt private blackmail first. If they possess only fragments, they can use implication. If they are reckless, they can threaten exposure before witnesses." Before witnesses. The room seemed to contract around the words. A ballroom, a supper, the coming dinner, the betrothal ball invitation folded in Cecily's reticule. Public joy could turn to public ruin in the space of one unfolded sheet. Julian's face had gone very still. "Then we move first." Pritchard blinked. "In what manner?" "The ball stands," he said. "Invitations go out today, not tomorrow. The engagement becomes larger, faster, harder to challenge without cost." Cecily looked up at him in disbelief. "You mean to hurry toward the danger?" "I mean to deny it the comfort of shadows." It was so like him now, that strange, stern instinct to meet threat with form and rank and deliberate visibility. She ought to have called it madness. Instead, what rose in her was something far more dangerous than fear. Trust. Pritchard was not convinced. "If the stolen paper appears in a crowded room, it will not appear there if we find who holds it first," Julian said. "And if you do not?" the solicitor asked quietly. Julian did not answer at once. His gaze met Cecily's then, and she saw the truth in it before he spoke. He had already measured the worst, already stepped to its edge in his mind. Whatever he said next would not be the language of contracts or tactics. At that exact moment, the front bell downstairs rang sharply. All three of them turned. A second later, the office boy knocked, pale-faced, and opened the door just enough to whisper, "Sir, there is a lady here asking whether the engagement papers are safe. She would not give her name, but she says she is a relation of Miss Dean, and she has brought an invitation list for the Duke's betrothal ball." Julian did not hesitate. "Keep her there," he told the office boy. The lad vanished at once, pale and eager. Mr. Pritchard shut the strongbox with a hard metallic snap that seemed to ring through all three of them. Cecily rose from her chair so quickly that the hem of her dress brushed the desk leg. Her heart was beating far too fast. Relation of Miss Dean. Invitation list for the betrothal ball. It was such a transparent excuse that only a fool would miss the threat beneath it, which meant the caller did not care whether she seemed transparent. She wanted them to know she had come. "Clarissa?" Cecily said. Pritchard adjusted his spectacles with unsteady fingers. The boy did not know her name. "It will be Clarissa," Julian said, "or someone sent in her place." That was somehow worse. If a thing had grown beyond cousins and sisters, beyond drawing-room spite into hired hands and paid clerks, then the whole matter had ceased to belong to family embarrassment. It had become strategy. Pritchard crossed to the door and paused. "What do you wish done?" Julian's answer came cold and exact. "Nothing imprudent. We meet her in the front room. The engagement papers are never named unless she names them first. If she asks after safety, you tell her your office protects all private legal matters and nothing further. If she produces anything—" He stopped, then looked at Cecily. "You need not be present." "I do," she said. He held her gaze for one long second, measuring whether this was courage or stubbornness. Perhaps it was both. At last he gave one short nod. The front office was brighter than the back room and infinitely more exposed. Daylight struggled through the narrow window. The stationer's ink smell mixed with damp wool, dust, and the stale sweetness of sealing wax warmed too often. A narrow chair stood near the counter, and in it sat Imogen. That startled Cecily more than if the elder sister had appeared. Imogen rose at once, gloved hands folded over a sheet of paper. She wore a plum pelisse trimmed in jet and an expression of injured delicacy that would have convinced a stranger of innocence within 30 seconds. Her eyes flickered from Cecily to Julian to Pritchard and back again. Fear lived somewhere under all that softness, but so did excitement. "Oh," she said lightly, "how fortunate. I did hope I might find you all together." "You hope to find my solicitor," Julian said. Imogen gave a tiny laugh. "Such a severe way of putting it. I only meant to save everyone trouble." Cecily felt cold spread slowly through her limbs. "What trouble?" Imogen lifted the paper in her hand. It was not the contract, only a guest list in Rosamond's neat script, copied for reference and already marked with additions in another hand. Several names were crossed through, several others circled. At the bottom, under a line of sharply written notes, one sentence had been added in pencil. "Read it aloud before supper if they deny it." Cecily stared. Imogen watched her face with awful attentiveness. "Clarissa thought it best," she said softly, "that no one be embarrassed in ignorance." Julian took one step forward. That would have given the whole thing too much drama, but something in him altered enough that even Imogen's practiced poise faltered. "Where is your sister?" he asked. Imogen moistened her lips. "At home?" "No." It was only one word, but it cracked through the room like ice under weight. Imogen's gaze dropped. There it was, the weakness Clarissa did not possess. Vanity made her reckless. Fear made her pliable. "Where is she?" Cecily asked, and this time her own voice sounded unlike her, steady, low, with no tremor left in it at all. Imogen looked at the floorboards. "At Aldermore House." The silence that followed felt enormous. Julian's expression did not change, but all warmth had gone out of the room with those 3 words. Cecily understood at once. Clarissa had not merely stolen knowledge, she had carried it straight into the house where the ball would be held. Then Imogen, still not looking up, whispered the thing that turned dread into certainty. "She says if you will not end it quietly, she will make him read the whole agreement before the assembly." No one spoke for a full breath after Imogen's whisper. The front office seemed suddenly too bright, too cramped, every object cruelly clear. The invitation list in her gloved hands, the dust caught along the window sash, the blurred shadow of passers-by beyond the glass who knew nothing of the ruin being weighed in that little room. Cecily felt as though the floor beneath her had shifted a hair's breadth and never quite settled again. Julian recovered first, though recover was hardly the word. He did not soften, he became colder. "She has the document?" he asked. Imogen swallowed. "She has enough of it." "Enough," he repeated, meaning what? Imogen's eyes flicked helplessly toward Cecily, then away. "The whole, I think, or nearly. She would not show me every page, only enough to make me understand that if you tried to silence her, she could silence you more completely." Pritchard made a sound under his breath that might have been fury or shame. Cecily barely heard it. Her attention had narrowed to Julian's face. He looked carved from winter itself. "And Rosamond?" he asked. Imogen hesitated too long. That was answer enough. Julian's jaw tightened. "My sister knows." "Not everything," Imogen said quickly. "At least, I do not think so. Clarissa went to Aldermore House this morning with the pretense of discussing the guest list. She said Lady Rosamond need only know that she possessed information capable of saving the family from public ridicule. They have been closeted together for an hour." Cecily shut her eyes. It was all knitting together now, the invitation list, the language of timing, the hunger for spectacle. Clarissa had understood something essential, that truth alone was not enough. It had to be staged, read aloud, made theatrical. Shame, to satisfy her, must have witnesses. When Cecily opened her eyes again, Julian was looking at her. There are glances that ask permission, and glances that offer apology, and glances that say, "I would spare you if I could." This was none of those. It was steadier and more difficult. It said only this: "I will not lie to you now." "If Clarissa has gone to my house," he said, "then the dinner tonight is no longer a dinner. It is a rehearsal." "For the ball," Cecily said. "Yes." Pritchard stepped forward. "Then cancel it. Cancel both." Julian turned. "And concede the field? No." "This is no longer a matter of social maneuver," the solicitor said sharply. "If that woman means to expose the agreement before a room full of peers, you must end the engagement at once and shape the story yourself before she does." At that, something fierce rose in Cecily so suddenly it surprised even her. "No." The three of them looked at her, even Imogen. Cecily felt her pulse beating in her throat, but her voice did not shake. "If we end it now, Clarissa wins before she has spoken. She will say she forced it. She will say I trapped him and was cast off. She will say whatever she pleases, and people will believe the worst because the worst is always the tidiest story." Julian's eyes did not leave her face. "She is right," he said quietly. Pritchard stared. "My lord?" "She is right," he repeated. "This does not end in withdrawal." The room seemed to draw inward around the decision. Outside, a cart clattered past. Somewhere a church bell began striking the quarter hour, each note hard and measured. Imogen pressed her lips together. "Then what will you do?" Julian held Cecily's gaze one heartbeat longer before answering. "Attend dinner. Hold the ball. Let them think they are driving us toward the trap they have laid." "And when they spring it?" Pritchard asked. Julian did not reply at once. Instead, he stepped closer to Cecily, close enough that only she could truly see the strain held under his composure, the weariness, the resolve. And something else now, something unhidden at last and far more dangerous than any stolen paper. Then, low enough for only her to hear, he said, "When the moment comes, do not be afraid of what I choose." That evening, as dusk gathered over Aldermore House and the footman opened the door to admit the Dean party to dinner, Clarissa was already inside, smiling. Dinner at Aldermore House passed in a tension so polished it almost gleamed. Silver flashed, crystal rang softly. Rosamond watched everything. Lady Aldermore spoke with formal calm. Clarissa, seated farther down the table than she had hoped, smiled too often and drank almost nothing. Cecily wore blue, just as the note had instructed, but she wore it without apology, and when Julian offered her his arm before the second course, when he asked her opinion on the music for the betrothal ball, as if no other woman's judgment in the room could matter half so much, she saw Clarissa's triumph begin to fray. Whatever private ruin her cousin had planned, she had expected panic, distance, coldness. She had not expected him to choose visibility over retreat. By the time the ladies rose, Rosamond had gone pale with comprehension, and Lady Aldermore, watching her son pour wine for Cecily before he served himself, looked less offended than unsettled. Something real had entered a game that had been designed for calculation. The ball, 3 nights later, blazed through Aldermore House like a challenge thrown at the whole of London. Candles burned in mirrored ranks. Musicians filled the air with strings bright enough to hide 100 whispered judgments. Cecily descended the staircase on Julian's arm and felt the room take her in all at once, as the woman he had brought before them and meant to keep there. He was all ducal assurance in black and white, but his hand against hers was warm, steady, human. "Whatever happens," he murmured, so low only she heard it, "do not mistake me." Then the guests parted, and Clarissa stepped forward from the edge of the supper room with folded papers in her hand. Her voice carried too clearly. She spoke of fraud, of female desperation, of a gentleman tricked into a false engagement. Gasps moved through the assembly like a sudden draft. Rosamond closed her eyes as if the disgrace had finally exceeded even her appetite for control. Clarissa held up the stolen sheets and declared that if the Duke was an honorable man, he would read them aloud himself. For one terrible instant, Cecily felt the entire room tilt toward her shame. Then Julian released her hand, walked straight to Clarissa, and held out his own. She gave him the pages with a smile already forming. He looked down at them only long enough to know what they were. Then he tore the paper to pieces. Once, twice, again. White fragments drifted across the ballroom floor like spoiled snow. "This," he said, and his voice cut through the silence to the farthest chandelier, "was an agreement made when fear governed us both. It governs nothing now." He turned, not to the crowd, but to Cecily. "Miss Dean did not ensnare me. She trusted me when I had done nothing to deserve such trust. If there is any truth to be spoken tonight, it is this: I love her. I have come to love her beyond prudence, beyond arrangement, beyond every line written on that page. She is the woman I choose before this house and every witness in it." No one moved. No one breathed. Cecily crossed the distance between them herself. "I will not be shamed by being chosen," she said, and the strength in her own voice startled her. "And I will not deny that I choose him too." The first applause came from Lady Aldermore. It was only one sharp clap, almost angry in its force, but it broke the spell. Then Rosamond joined her. Then the rest of the room followed, relief and astonishment and delight crashing together until the ballroom shook with it. Clarissa stood abandoned in the center of her own little ruin, while Julian bowed his head to Cecily as though she had just granted him the greatest honor of his life. When he drew her into the first dance, there was nothing formal in the way he looked at her. "No more paper," he whispered. "No more pretense." And when she smiled up at him, the music swelled around them, and the future, at last, felt larger than survival. Later, long after the last carriage had gone, a few torn white scraps still lay caught in the candle wax by the musician's platform. They looked very small there. What had weight in the end was not the page, but the hand that refused to read from it. At breakfast the next morning, Cecily found the green volume of Plutarch waiting beside her cup, opened to the pressed fern he had once forgotten between its pages. Across the blank leaf beneath it, Julian had written only 4 words: "No more borrowed terms." If this one stayed with you, leave me a comment and subscribe for the next story.